I want to talk a little bit, starting about infrastructure, and you've heard this infrastructure story a little bit so far, but I also want to sort of set a context of kind of some of the tensions that we operate in at KC Digital Drive. There's a lot of lines that we walk and things that sort of pull us in multiple directions, and a couple of those were highlighted right at the beginning of the playbook. And I will say too, there's this past future. We've talked a lot about what we've done, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the playbook, but we will get to the future as well, and sort of where we see this going. But one of those was between technology and sociology. There's a line that gets quoted a lot that people always like at other conferences that I'm at, that building an internet ecosystem in a metropolis is 10% about the technology and 90% about the sociology. And so we talk a lot about technology. We think a lot about technology. Obviously, we're immersed in technology. But what we really care about as an organization is the people. And sociology even is sort of an academic term that gets a little bit removed even sometimes. But what we really care about, what we really bring to this equation is how do you deal with people? How do you think about how technology affects people? And how do you make sure that the people who live in our city, the people who live in the Kansas City region, have the future that they want, that is meaningful to them, and that is not driven by technology, but that the people are the ones who are guiding the technology. So that's one of them. The other sort of main precept of the playbook is that it's not about Google, and it's hard to remember that sometimes. Even though we love Google, and it's been great. I mean, you can't deny the catalytic effect that's had on our community. But it's easy to forget that Sure West, now Consolidated, has brought hundreds of miles of fiber. They brought fiber through my backyard. Well, I'm still waiting for Google to get there in Mission, Kansas. AT&T came to me sometime after we started and said, hey, we've got these 200 buildings, and we're bringing fiber to business, to these buildings, in a way that hadn't been there before. Comcast, liNKCity, as I mentioned earlier. Right, we have a lot of fiber in Kansas City. We have the most robust and competitive telco market in the country. And telco markets aren't a really sexy thing to talk about. That's not fun. That's not about people necessarily. It's about infrastructure, right? So this tension between infrastructure and people is another thing that we walk, right? How do we be about infrastructure? How do we care about that, but also care about people? How do we acknowledge the fact that Google Fiber brought a lot of money and a lot of resources and a lot of infrastructure into our city, but that we have a lot of fiber providers here? So these are some of the challenges that we face. And then we have this thing about looking backward and looking forward. And the future's a really big place, right? It's hard to imagine. Mayor James said, we can't even imagine what it's going to be like 40 years from now. And maybe we can't, but we can try. And so that's kind of where we start. What was really impactful for us, and one of the things that drives us, is that we can imagine the future, that we can think about what it's going to be like in 40 years. That when somebody says, hey, we've got gigabit fiber and we're bringing it to houses, we can think about, well, what does that mean? What is that likely to cause? What are the changes that are going to result from that? And how do we deal with it? So when we were faced with this task of vastness, not only looking to the future, but if you look at the playbook and if you've seen all the plays that have gone on screen as people have been talking, there's things like telehealth pilots and K-12 education pilots and access to capital and digital infrastructure. It's a lot of different stuff. And it's like, okay, how do you do this? What are you actually going to do in the face of kind of what seems like this enormous task around building a digital city? And the first thing that we did was educate ourselves. And so that's one of the ways that you start to imagine the future, is to start learning about what it means, to learn that fiber is a thing. Okay, and so as we think about community, as we think about the people, we also need to remember that we've still got a huge competitive advantage here in the amount of fiber that is buried under our streets and that is hung from our telephone poles. And that's something that we can't let go unused. We've got probably $500 million of investment, of private investment, in this public good infrastructure that's been invested over the past few years and will be over the next. And we look at big infrastructure projects that are $500 million projects, convention hotels, Power and Light District out at the Speedway, the airport, right? These are things that generate a lot of debate and they generate a lot of follow-on investment. We spend money to make sure that these things work and to make sure that they make our community a better place. And it's easier to do that to not do that with fiber. One, because it's buried. Two, because people don't really know what it does. And three, because we're not paying for it. The private companies are coming and laying out this infrastructure. But if we're going to use this to improve our city, we've really got to be forward thinking about how to do that. We've got to learn a lot about what it means. And so that's one of the things that we have done as an organization. But the second thing, in the face of sort of this huge expanse of opportunity, is to think about what can you actually do? What can you do now? What are the concrete steps that we can take to make a difference in the face of all of kind of the world of possibilities? And the third thing is to continue to engage in dialogue. So on the one hand, you've got your big ideas, okay? This is another sort of tension between the big idea and like the concrete thing that you can do right now. Some of the projects that we've heard about. Carrie was talking about the Gigabit Community Fund pilots. We've got the Living Lab that's coming online. We have our Code for America Brigade that Paul Barham leads and is really devoted towards building code that can solve simple government problems. Paul, right here, thank you. We have a lot of projects, and that's really our core metric. And then we talk about these things, right? So we have the big ideas, we have the little projects, and then we bring people together to have conversations and sort of continue that virtuous cycle. So that's really kind of how our work is. We knew from the outset that what do you do with Google Fiber isn't necessarily the right question. It's not the ultimate question, but it was the question we had at the time. It was the question we asked. And so we brought people together. We brought healthcare professionals together, which has evolved into our monthly healthcare meetings and our digital health innovation forums. We brought developers together, which has evolved into our 1 billion bits developer meetup. We brought educators together, which led to the Gigabit Community Fund. And we asked these questions of other cities throughout the world who have fiber and who were exploring things like smart cities 3 or 4 years ago. Mayor James mentioned the Barcelona trip, where we looked to see what's going on in Barcelona, what's going on in Amsterdam, what's going on in Seoul, where they've had fiber, where they're starting to deploy sensors, where they're doing this smart city stuff. What does that look like? Let's start thinking about those things and then bring them back here and see what we can do. And then how do we do it, right? So how do you find those projects? Morgan mentioned the hackathons that we started to plan, about thinking how do you take gigabit opportunity and put it into action. So again, the idea of putting these ideas into action, of finding places where we can have small pilot projects that experiment with some of the technology that we're talking about, that's a really critical thing that we can do here. And that's how you build a social infrastructure in the future, a people-based infrastructure, an innovation economy here in Kansas City that really outlasts and outstrips the hard infrastructure that's in the ground. Because other people can build the hard infrastructure. It costs a lot of money, and it's hard to do, but everyone's going to do it, right? This is another thing about looking forward, right? Fiber is going to be everywhere. So fiber is going to be an advantage for a certain amount of time, but how do we build a culture that knows how to look for what's coming next, that can experiment and figure out how to use those things to make people's lives better, and how to guide that process, and to do it in a human, intelligible, heartfelt, social way. I don't know how many people in here know Bill Mullins. Bill is sort of your average nuclear systems engineer around town. And he pops up a lot of things. He's in his mid-60s. He played Little League Baseball with my dad in a small town in Michigan, which is something I found out well down the road. And Bill likes to talk about systems theory. And he had a post on Reddit the other day about smart cities, and it was in response to something I'd written. He said, KC Digital Drive is sort of positioning itself as a leader, but who are their followers? What are they doing? And we've been having this conversation about what the need is in the community. Bill and I have for several years. He was at all the MBIT meetings way back when. And it's a fair question, and it's one that's important to answer. And if we're going to ask you to give us money or to give us support in various ways, you do need to know what it is that we're doing and why we exist, right? When we started this 3 years ago, there was a question about whether we need a new organization. Nobody likes to start new organizations, except entrepreneurs. They like to start them all the time. But civic organizations, sort of this idea of civic capacity. And we looked around and we said, okay, where should this live? Who else is doing this stuff? And the answer was no one, really. No one's sort of thinking in this, 2 or 3 generations out way about the future. No one is really sort of immersed in technology. There's nobody thinking about fiber. That was pretty new to everyone. And so we didn't start an organization at that time, but we started doing the work. And we said, we can't go out and start an organization. We can't go out and ask people to support something when we haven't really done anything yet. We have a document produced by a mayor's task force, and that was a really compelling document, but what are you going to do with it? And so we spent a year and a half working with Mid-America Regional Council, who Mike mentioned helped write the playbook, but they also gave us a ton of support to start to think through this question and figure out what kind of civic capacity do we need. And along the way, we talked to a lot of other cities who were discovering the same thing. And at this time, it was cities like Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Lafayette, Louisiana, Burlington, Vermont, who had fiber networks. And really interesting to me, they had people in those cities who were asking all these same questions, who were faced with this same forward-looking, future-oriented, tech-based, civic-based, how do you make it about the people question. and they didn't know where to go for support. They didn't have a model. They didn't have a place in their community that was helping to navigate these issues. And so Ken Hayes in Chattanooga, eventually after he saw what we did here, got his mayor to start his own task force, and then start the Enterprise Center, which is a nonprofit that exists in a lot of the same spaces. In Burlington, Vermont, Ray Daniels went up for the launch of Burlington Ignite, which was another program that works in these same spaces that we are active in. And we saw, and Deb will talk about this a little bit later, that this is something that is needed. This is something that is needed in cities that are looking to the future, a new capacity. And that's what we represent here. This is the work that we do. And so the work that we do, if you go back to the three things that we started with, which are educating ourselves, finding small projects to work on that you can actually tackle now, and then talking about it, that's really become, on a broader scale, what our mission is. So you heard the mayor's talk about digital leadership. And overall, we want Kansas City to be a digital leader. That is at the core of our mission. We think by being a digital leader, we will increase economic opportunities for the people that live here, and we'll identify new technology applications that can make people's lives better. What that means is a few things. The first is that we need to close the digital divide. That we need to make sure digital tools are accessible broadly across the community, that people aren't shut out as progress happens in one part of the town, that it doesn't ignore other parts of the city, that we have equitable access to tools. And that's really the education piece, right? It's not just about knowing how to turn on a computer, knowing how to send an email, but it's knowing how to think about things like autonomous vehicles. You might have seen the Star article today. There was a front page piece about smart pavements and the driverless cars of the future. We want to have a city of people who can think about things like that in an intelligent way and think, do we want that? And if we do, what's it going to look like? What are the policies that are going to be in place? And how is that going to affect the way that we live? Because those are the things that are happening in the future. So that, the digital divide is big. It goes from small all the way up. The second thing is to drive technology innovation through experimental pilot projects. You've heard from Morgan, you've heard from Joe and Carrie about the stuff that we're doing in education and healthcare. We want to create, again, a culture here, not just of entrepreneurship, where we're trying to create new businesses, but of sort of social entrepreneurship, where we're trying to create new projects, new platforms, new ideas that can improve people's lives in more of the social service sector, in things like education, public safety, even in the arts, where these organizations don't typically have the wherewithal or the time to be thinking through 2 or 3 generations of technology down the road. So this is the work that we're doing, but it's really, people have said nice things about Jason and I, which is great, but all of the people in this room, maybe half the people in this room, some of you probably didn't know who we were before tonight, but people like Paul, people like Ilya, people like Carrie, people like Herb and Blake and Mike Brown and Barrett Sidner, these people are all working closely with us on our initiatives. We couldn't do what we do without other people who have these same characteristics, who like to think about big ideas, but who like to get their hands dirty, kind of have their head in the clouds and their hands in the dirt, as it were. We need people who are doers, but we need people who are thinkers, and that's what we've done. And so through that, you may have seen in some of the video, we've brought over $1 million of investment back into the community. We've held hackathons that have helped to start businesses. We have 6 or 7 different event series. And what we'd really like to see going forward is some concrete deliverables in each of the areas that we're targeting. So we really want to see every household in Kansas City connected to fiber. We think that fiber is the infrastructure of the future. We think that having deep fiber penetration throughout this community, businesses, homes, schools, libraries, is huge. And so we want to work to make that happen. We want to continue to create pilot projects and to encourage a culture of experimentation throughout sort of the human-centered ecosystem, to come up with experiments where we're really focused on what the human aspect and the human outcomes are. And we want to continue to grow the Gigabit City Summit and to transition that event into an event that is not necessarily a smart city event. Smart city is one platform, but a digital city event. We want to be the place here in Kansas City where other cities go to think about how do you build the digital city. How do you build the city of the future? How do you manage technology changes in a way that is respectful of the people that live there? And so that's what we're asking you to help with tonight. You'll see on your table in front of you, in addition to the schedule, which we've gone over by a little bit, but hopefully not too much, there is I've been calling it internally the engagement sheet when Jason and I talk about it. And the question that I hope that you'll go away with is, okay, this is cool, this is great, this is important work, how do we get involved? There are a number of ways that you can get involved, and we'll follow up more on that, but quickly. We are a 501c3 charitable organization. We are a nonprofit. You can donate to us. So we encourage you to think about that either personally or in terms of how your corporate responsibility budgets. You can sponsor our events. We have a lot of events, some of which we know that we're going to do in advance, others that we see opportunities and we kind of prop up at a moment's notice. We would love to talk with you about how to become an ongoing sponsor of the work that we do. You can hire us. You can read more about what that means, but when there are organizations, and there are a lot of them, that have goals that are in line with our nonprofit, we can do work for hire. That's kind of my background, was creating products and then selling them to people who wanted to buy them. So the nonprofit thing is still new to me. It's a few years, but we would love to work with like-minded people in exploring how we can create opportunities for Kansas City. For our healthcare vertical specifically, we have a membership platform. We've delivered enough value and created enough of a community with our healthcare practitioners that you can actually become a member of our healthcare team, and we think that's a nice model for some of the other verticals as we continue to grow. And if you can't make a financial commitment, you can always show up at our events. Again, we have a lot of them. We have 1 Billion Bits. We have our Code for America Brigade that meets every Monday night. We have healthcare meetings. We have education meetings. We have our Gigabit City Summit. And we encourage you to check those out. We encourage you to continue the work that you're doing on projects and plays, those of you who are taking sort of the mandate of the playbook and executing it. And we are really grateful to everyone for your support, for your participation, and for caring.